Meghan encouraged the vengeance. Meghan encouraged the anger and the hatred and seeing enemies and paranoia.
She is trapped between explaining a story that raises new questions and ignoring a story that allows those questions to grow on their own. The most dangerous information isn't the information that destroys a reputation. It's the information that makes people revisit everything they thought they already understood. Hold that thought. Before we go anywhere near the agreement, just look at the calendar with me for a second. Because there is a specific pattern hiding in the timing of these events, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. March 2021. Meghan Markle sits across from Oprah Winfrey, 49 million viewers watching in real time, and delivers what appears to be a final, definitive version of events. A closed chapter. The kind of statement that signals, this story is over. January 2023. The memoir lands. 416 pages. Harry and Meghan in their own words on their own terms. Another final, definitive version. Another closed chapter. And then May 2024. Tom BOWER, investigative author with a documented track record of confronting power structures at close range, makes a series of public observations. He is not reporting a leak. He is not publishing speculation. He is drawing attention to something that was already in the public record. Something quiet. Something that had been sitting there, unremarked upon, for longer than most people realized. Private agreement. An agreement attached to a specific date. And the moment that date became visible, the entire timeline began to look different. Here is what nobody is saying out loud right now. The agreement itself is not the story. The agreement was never the story. What the agreement did, what it continues to do, is reopen questions that had been formally, publicly, definitively closed. And there is nothing more destabilizing to a managed public narrative than a question that refuses to stay closed. Think about the structural position this creates. On one side, acknowledge the agreement, explain it, give it context. But every explanation raises a new question. Every clarification invites a follow-up. Every public statement about the agreement keeps the agreement alive in the news cycle, which is precisely where it cannot be allowed to live without cost. On the other side, say nothing. Let the agreement sit. Let observers draw their own conclusions. But silence, in the face of a documented, time-stamped, already public piece of information, is not neutral. Silence is a position, and that position generates its own momentum. She is trapped between explaining a story that raises new questions and ignoring a story that allows those questions to grow on their own. Two questions open right now that we are going to answer before this video ends. First, what exactly was this agreement? And why does the date attached to it matter so much? Second, why are people, journalists, observers, commentators who covered this story for years, suddenly revisiting events they had long considered settled? Before we go deeper into what this really means, for Meghan, for the institution, for the broader power structure surrounding both, make sure you are subscribed. Every time a story like this resurfaces, the first people to understand the mechanism behind it are the people who have been watching closely. Don't miss the next chapter. The agreement itself wasn't the real problem. The timing was. Because once people looked at the date attached to it, the specific documented timestamp date, the entire timeline began to look different. And a timeline that looks different from every direction at once is not a timeline anyone can control from the outside. We are about to understand exactly how that works. Every channel right now is telling you the same version of this story. They are telling you this is about a private agreement between Meghan Markle and a royal institution, and that Tom BOWER revealed something embarrassing, and that there is drama, and then the coverage ends there. That is the headline. And that headline is, at best, a description. Descriptions don't explain anything. They don't tell you why the agreement existed, why the timing is significant, or why an investigative author with a specific and documented track record is the person drawing attention to it now. Here's what nobody is saying out loud. This was never simply a personal conflict. It was never simply a story about a woman and an institution that could not find common ground. Underneath the personal narrative, underneath every interview, every memoir chapter, every public statement, there was a different war running entirely. An institutional war. And institutional wars have different rules, different weapons, and different casualties than personal ones. The four forces in play are worth naming clearly, because this is the frame you will need for everything that follows. First, traditional institutions. And by traditional, I mean structures whose authority derives from continuity, from the unspoken agreement that they have always existed, and therefore always will. The British royal family is the most visible example on earth of this category. Its power is not legislative. It is not financial. It is almost entirely perceptual, which means perceptual threats are existential threats. Second, modern celebrity influence, a force that operates under entirely different rules. Celebrity influence does not require continuity or historical legitimacy. It requires attention, narrative, and the ability to speak directly to an audience without intermediaries. It is, by its nature, in structural competition with traditional authority, because it offers individuals an alternative source of meaning, loyalty, and identity that does not flow through institutions. Third, media ecosystems, not a single entity. A network of competing incentive structures, tabloids, broadcast networks, digital platforms, podcasts, each with its own commercial logic, its own definition of what constitutes news, and its own relationship to the power structures it covers. The media ecosystem does not simply report on institutional conflicts. It participates in them, amplifies them, and sometimes manufactures them. Fourth, personal brands. This is the piece that most coverage consistently underweights. A personal brand is not just a public image. It is a commercial asset with a balance sheet. The decisions made in a narrative war, what to say, when to say it, what to sign, and what to agree to, directly affect the financial value of that asset. And that means every personal and emotional decision in this story is also a commercial decision. People often mistake visible conflicts for the real battle happening underneath. What you see in the headlines is the personal drama. What you almost never see is the institutional infrastructure surrounding it. The agreements, the contractual frameworks, the brand partnerships, the legal structures, all of which are running simultaneously, and all of which interact with every public statement made by every party. The agreement Tom BOWER is drawing attention to is a product of that infrastructure. It is not a personal document. It is an institutional document with a personal signature on it. And the difference between those two things is enormous. Then a strange pattern started appearing. Observers who had covered this story from entirely different angles, royal correspondents, brand analysts, media critics, legal commentators, began arriving at the same question from completely different directions. The same question kept emerging from completely different people. Why does the date matter so much? Before we go any further, Tom BOWER's role in this story needs to be established precisely. Because there is a specific kind of dismissal that gets applied to anyone who raises inconvenient questions about powerful public figures, particularly powerful public figures who have cultivated a sympathetic media profile. The dismissal goes roughly like this. This person is politically motivated, personally biased, or simply chasing a commercial story. And once that dismissal lands, the actual content of what is being said disappears behind the character attack. Tom BOWER is not a royal watcher. He is not a tabloid columnist. He is an investigative author with a documented, multi-decade track record of researching and publishing on powerful institutions and the individuals who lead them. His subjects have included Robert Maxwell, Richard Branson, Gordon Brown, and Tony Blair, none of whom, it should be noted, were figures who welcomed scrutiny. His methodology is not commentary. It is documentation. Primary sources, paper trails, time-stamped records, named individuals. Here is what matters about that track record in the context of this story specifically. BOWER has been sued. He has faced legal challenges from subjects who disputed his findings. He has not been successfully defamed. That is not a personality trait. That is a legal record. And a legal record of that kind is meaningful in a way that no number of endorsements or positive reviews can replicate, because it means that subjects with access to legal resources, with motivated legal teams, with every institutional incentive to identify and litigate against factual errors, have repeatedly attempted to do so and failed. When BOWER draws attention to an agreement, he is not speculating about its existence. He is noting something that is already in the public record. He is functioning as an analyst of a document, not a source of a leak. That distinction matters enormously, and it is the distinction that most of the coverage around his comments has flattened entirely. Reputation compounds exactly like trust. Each investigation that withstands legal challenge adds to the credibility reserve of the one that follows. By the time BOWER publishes his biography of Meghan, Revenge, Meghan, Harry, and the War Between the Windsors, the credibility reservoir from the prior 2 decades is already deep. Observers who have watched his methodology operate in other high-stakes contexts apply a different level of weight to his observations than they would apply to commentary from a less documented source. This matters for the agreement question in a specific way. When an investigative author with BOWER's track record notes that an agreement exists, notes that it carries a specific date, and observes that the date is significant, the response from the subject becomes part of the story. Not because the subject is required to respond, but because a documented forensic analyst pointing at a public document and saying this date matters is a different kind of claim than an anonymous source saying the same thing. It survives the first news cycle. It survives the second. It begins to generate secondary coverage from outlets that would not have touched the original claim. Then observers noticed something unexpected. It wasn't the coverage of the agreement that began generating attention. It was the silence around it. It wasn't what was being said that created concern. It was what people suddenly stopped saying. The agreement had created a zone of quiet in a story that had, for 4 years, been extraordinarily loud. And zones of quiet, in stories built on public narrative control, are always louder than anything that is actually said. Here is the mechanism. And once I lay it out, you are going to recognize it running everywhere in the story. Not just in the agreement, but in every public statement, every interview choice, every silence. A question surfaces about the agreement. Not an allegation. A question. That question generates doubt, not about facts, but about the completeness of the narrative that has been publicly constructed. The doubt generates scrutiny. Scrutiny reveals inconsistencies. Inconsistencies generate more questions. More questions generate more doubt. And the loop runs without requiring any new information at all, because the mechanism is self-fueling. Each rotation of the loop makes the next rotation slightly faster. Watch how the loop runs. The agreement exists. Its existence is in the public record. Tom BOWER draws attention to it. Mainstream outlets pick up BOWER's observation. Audiences encounter the observation and apply it to the existing public narrative. The existing public narrative, which was constructed to be complete and final, now has a visible gap in it. The gap generates a question. The question generates more scrutiny of the existing public narrative. More gaps appear. More questions follow. The loop has started. Now here is what makes this mechanism particularly difficult to interrupt. The agreement is not the center of the loop. The agreement is the inciting event. What runs the loop is the gap between the agreement's existence and the public narrative's claim to completeness. Every time the narrative claims completeness, the existence of the unremarked agreement proves it isn't complete. And every time someone draws attention to the gap, the narrative has to either acknowledge the gap, which confirms incompleteness, or ignore it, which allows the gap to grow. The receipts are public. This is not a document that requires insider access to find. It does not require a source. It does not require a leak. It sits in the existing record, carrying a date, attached to real events, in a sequence that was never fully explained to the public. Which means any viewer who hears BOWER's observation can immediately verify the first layer of it themselves. And an audience that can verify the first layer of a claim will always reach for the second layer. Who benefits when uncertainty grows? That is the second curiosity loop we opened in Chapter 1, and we are going to resolve it, but not yet. Because to understand who benefits from uncertainty, you first have to understand exactly who uncertainty costs. And the cost structure of this specific uncertainty is not what most coverage suggests. The power structures surrounding the royal family are not primarily threatened by damaging facts. They have survived damaging facts for centuries. What threatens them is unpredictability, the condition in which it becomes impossible to forecast the next development, which makes it impossible to manage the institutional response. Uncertainty converts a manageable communications problem into an unmanageable structural one. Perception creates influence. Trust sustains it. And a narrative that has been publicly declared complete, final, and authoritative, and then turns out to contain an unremarked agreement carrying a significant date, is a narrative that has lost something it cannot easily recover. Not facts. Facts can be added, clarified, corrected. What it has lost is the quality of completeness. And completeness, once lost, cannot simply be reclaimed by adding more information. More information can make a narrative more detailed, cannot make it whole again. Then the pressure moved beyond headlines. It reached places where headlines rarely reach on their own. It reached people with something to lose. Confidence is strongest before scrutiny begins. And for a remarkably long stretch, longer than most observers will acknowledge, the public narrative constructed around Meghan Markle's departure from the royal family had operated with a quality that almost nothing in public life achieves. It was largely unchallenged on its own terms. The Oprah interview set the terms. The memoir reinforced them. Every subsequent media appearance operated within a framework the narrative itself had constructed. This is not unusual. Powerful individuals with media access have always had the ability to set interpretive frames. What was unusual was the degree to which the frame held. For years, the mainstream coverage largely accepted the premise that the account given by Harry and Meghan was the definitive account. Then two things happened. Not simultaneously, but close enough together that the overlap became visible. The first was the agreement. The second was the timeline. Let me lay the timeline out precisely, because this is where the mechanism becomes visible to anyone who looks directly at it. The agreement, according to the public record, was reached at a specific point in the transition process, the period commonly referred to as Megxit, the formal withdrawal of Harry and Meghan from their senior royal roles. What matters is not the agreement itself in isolation. What matters is the sequence. The agreement was reached before specific public statements were made. And some of those public statements, made in formal, on-camera, international broadcast contexts, describe the transition in terms that do not easily accommodate the existence of the agreement. This is not an allegation of dishonesty. It is an observation about completeness. At first, it looked insignificant. A minor inconsistency, the kind of detail that gets lost in the volume of a 400-page memoir. The kind of thing that only a forensic reader or a forensic author with a documented methodology would bother to notice. But forensic readers noticed it. And then another old statement resurfaced. Not a new revelation. A statement that had been public for years, made in an interview on camera with attribution, that described the circumstances of the agreement in terms that did not match the documented sequence. Not a dramatic contradiction. A quiet one. The kind that does not generate headlines on its own, but that, once noticed, cannot be unnoticed. The media reassessment began slowly. A single column, then a second, then a fact-check that wasn't really a fact-check. More of an observation that the publicly available timeline contained a gap that had never been adequately explained. Commentary shifted, not among tabloid outlets. Tabloid outlets had been skeptical from the beginning, and their skepticism was easily dismissed as motivated. The shift happened among outlets that had been sympathetic. Among journalists who had accepted the narrative on its own terms and were now quietly beginning to apply the kind of scrutiny they had withheld. Narrative inconsistencies are not interesting in themselves. They become interesting when the subject is a narrative that has been publicly declared complete and authoritative. Because then the inconsistency is not just a gap in a story. It is evidence that the story, as presented, does not fully account for the documented reality. Confidence is strongest before scrutiny begins. Once scrutiny began, the timeline did not shatter. It didn't need to. It simply began to look slightly different from every direction at once. At first, it looked insignificant. Then another old statement resurfaced. Here is a specific kind of problem that public figures almost never anticipate until it is already happening to them. Public statements are made in a specific moment, for a specific audience, in a specific context. They are designed to be understood in the terms of that moment, not stress-tested against documents that may resurface years later. No communications team plans for the possibility that a private agreement will one day be laid alongside a public broadcast interview and compared, date by date, statement by statement. But that is exactly what began happening. 3 specific interviews are now being revisited in the context of the agreement. I am not going to call them contradictions because a forensic approach requires precision, and the word contradiction implies clear binary error. What these interviews contain is something more structural and more interesting than contradiction. They contain framing choices, and framing choices that made complete sense in the moment they were made look significantly different when laid against a document that was not publicly known at the time the framing was constructed. The first interview is the Oprah conversation. 49 million viewers, watched globally, cited repeatedly as the definitive account of events. In that conversation, Meghan describes the process of separation from the royal family in terms that emphasize isolation, lack of institutional support, and the absence of options. That framing is not impossible to reconcile with the existence of an agreement, but it requires explanation. It requires a public account of how an agreement was reached, what it contained, and how it fits within the framework of events as described. That explanation has not been publicly offered. The second interview is more recent and more specific. A conversation in which the terms of the departure are discussed, again in language that emphasizes powerlessness and institutional failure, without any reference to the agreement's existence or its contents. Again, not a contradiction, a framing choice, but a framing choice that now sits alongside a public document in a way that invites comparison. Past interviews, public positioning, timeline analysis. The audience begins seeing the broader pattern. Not a pattern of deception, because that is not what the evidence shows. A pattern of incomplete framing. A pattern of public narratives constructed for maximum effect in specific moments, without accounting for the possibility that documents outside the narrator's control would eventually be laid alongside them. And here is what makes this mechanically difficult to respond to. A complete fabrication can be corrected. You name the fabrication, you provide the correction, you move on. An incomplete framing cannot be corrected in the same way, because correcting it requires acknowledging that the framing was incomplete, which raises the question of why it was incomplete, which raises the question of what else might be incomplete, which reopens every prior statement for re-examination. The emotional midpoint of this story is not a dramatic revelation. It is a much quieter and more uncomfortable moment. The moment when an audience that was already sympathetic begins applying the same scrutiny it withheld out of sympathy. Growing contradictions in perception. That is the phrase the framework gives us. And it is precise. Not growing contradictions, in fact. Growing contradictions in the perception of what has been said, by whom, when, and in what context relative to what was already agreed. That wasn't the moment everything changed. The next reaction revealed something far more important. Because the reaction didn't come from critics, came from allies. Let me slow down here, because underneath all of these documents and timelines and institutional mechanisms, there are real people who did not sign up to be collateral damage in a war between power structures. I want to tell you about someone who most people will never hear named in this story. Her name is Claire Whitmore. She is 43 years old. She lives outside of Bristol, England. She is a secondary school art teacher. She does not have a publicist. She does not have a communications team. She has a mortgage, 2 teenage children, and until 2 years ago, a volunteer role with a charitable organization that had received formal public support from the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. Claire had been a volunteer with that organization for 7 years when the Sussex connection was announced. The announcement was significant. Royal Association, even informal Royal Association, carries institutional weight that translates into fundraising capacity, public visibility, and donor confidence. Claire's organization saw a measurable increase in donations in the weeks following the announcement. She saw it in the numbers. She saw it in the attendance at their events. She saw the genuine, practical benefit that proximity to a recognized public figure produced for work she had given years of her life to. Then the public narrative around the Sussexes began to destabilize. The organization did not lose its funding overnight. It doesn't work that way. What it lost, gradually, was the clarity of its association. Donors who had given specifically because of the Sussex connection became cautious. Not hostile. Cautious. Uncertainty is enough. When donors cannot predict whether their association with a given figure will read as positive or negative in 12 months' time, they hedge. They wait. They give elsewhere. Claire didn't leave the organization. She stayed. She put in the same hours, ran the same programs, served the same families. but she watched the fundraising numbers move in the wrong direction. She watched grants that had been informally encouraged become harder to access. She watched colleagues who had been energized by the royal connection become quieter about it. She had no idea. She had no idea that a private agreement, reached between institutions at a level of power she would never access, would eventually create a zone of uncertainty that would ripple downward through the charitable ecosystem and land, quietly, in the fundraising spreadsheet of a 7-year volunteer in Bristol. People become collateral damage when powerful groups fight for influence. Claire is not a dramatic casualty. She is a quiet one. And quiet casualties are the ones the public narrative machine almost never accounts for, because they don't generate headlines. They generate slow attrition, gradual erosion, the kind of damage that shows up in spreadsheets and volunteer retention numbers, and the slow shrinkage of a service that Real families depend on. This is the human cost the media coverage does not reach. Have you ever been in a situation where nobody knew the full story, but everyone felt pressured to pick a side? Where the picking of a side, not the facts, not the outcome, was what caused the damage. That is what I am asking about in the comments right now. Because I suspect more people have lived inside that dynamic than the public conversation ever acknowledges. The emotional cost was obvious. The institutional cost was only beginning. Because where the story goes next is not into feelings. It goes into money, into risk management, into the specific commercial and institutional mechanisms that make uncertainty not just uncomfortable, but genuinely dangerous to the entities that have attached themselves to this public narrative. Power structures can survive criticism. Almost every major institution in the modern era has survived damaging revelations, scandals, exposures, internal failures, and emerged intact on the other side. The British royal family has survived abdications and affairs and decades of tabloid assault. It is still there. The mechanism of survival is well understood. Ride out the cycle. Do not amplify the story by over-responding. Let the news will turn. What power structures struggle to survive is unpredictability. Unpredictability is different from damage. Damage is finite. A damaging story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Reputational repair has a documented cost. Brand advisors, communications consultants, and institutional crisis managers all know how to price the repair of finite damage. They have done it before. They will do it again. What they cannot price is an open question. An open question does not have a cost structure. It has a probability distribution. It might resolve tomorrow. It might resurface in 3 years. It might generate a legal action. It might produce a book chapter. It might appear in the background of an unrelated story. The inability to forecast is the inability to manage. And the inability to manage is what converts a communications problem into a structural risk. Here is where the agreement becomes genuinely consequential in financial terms. Brand partnerships in the luxury and media sectors operate on confidence intervals. A brand that associates with a public figure is purchasing a confidence interval, a probabilistic assessment that the association will remain net positive for the duration of the contract. That assessment is built on predictability, on the assumption that the public narrative surrounding the figure will remain stable or improve within a calculable range. The agreement, by existing, by carrying a specific date, by being pointed at by an investigative author with a documented track record, has introduced a variable that was not in the original confidence calculation. Not a catastrophic variable. Not a deal-ending variable necessarily. A variable, an unknown. A factor that risk management teams now have to account for in ways they did not have to account for 6 months ago. Trust functions like currency. When currency is stable, it enables transactions. When it becomes unpredictable, transactions become cautious, hedged, or delayed. That is not drama. That is mechanics. Netflix, Spotify, Archwell, all 3 institutional relationships that Harry and Meghan carry into any commercial context, are now operating in an environment where the underlying narrative confidence has been degraded. Not destroyed, degraded. The Netflix Harry and Meghan documentary produced quantifiable viewership. The Spotify deal was ultimately terminated. Archwell's charitable output is documented. These are real outputs. But real outputs in the context of an uncertain public narrative are harder to convert into the next round of institutional investment. The specific legal question around the agreement, what it restricts, what it permits, what disclosure obligations it may or may not carry, has not been publicly litigated. But the existence of those questions is itself a risk factor. When a legal framework is ambiguous, the cost is not incurred in the courtroom. It is incurred in the hesitation of every institutional partner who asks their legal team to review the relationship and is told the situation is not fully resolved. Hesitation is expensive. Not dramatically, not visibly, but cumulatively. Then the entire story came full circle. The agreement had become almost irrelevant. Not because it didn't matter, but because what it had done could not be undone by any action taken in relation to the agreement itself. The process it had started was already running independently of its origin. The agreement itself was never the story. I need to say that clearly because by this point in the analysis it would be easy to have absorbed so much detail about the agreement, its existence, its date, its implications, that you begin to treat it as the central object. It is not. It was never the central object. It is the inciting event, the thing that set a specific mechanism in motion. And once that mechanism is running, it runs independently of the agreement that started it. Here is the real revelation. The story is the system that produced the agreement. And by system, I mean a specific combination of institutional forces that has no equivalent elsewhere in public life. The British royal family is an institution that runs on narrative as its primary resource. Not military power, not legislative authority, not financial leverage in any direct sense. Narrative. The story people tell themselves about what the royal family is, what it represents, and why it continues to exist is the source from which every other form of royal influence flows. Celebrity ecosystems operate on a different but parallel logic. A celebrity brand is also primarily a narrative resource. The story people tell themselves about who Meghan Markle is, what she represents, and why they are invested in her trajectory is the source from which every commercial relationship flows. Without that narrative, there is no Netflix deal. There is no Spotify deal. There is no charitable foundation with donor confidence. The narrative is the asset. When two narrative-based systems collide, when the royal institution's narrative and the celebrity brand's narrative make claims about the same events that cannot both be fully true, the collision does not produce a winner and a loser. Produces a zone of ambiguity, a cloud of uncertainty that covers both systems and degrades the confidence of everyone adjacent to either. The media incentive structure is the third element, and it is the one that most analysis underweights. Media outlets do not simply report on the collision between these two narrative systems. They participate in it. Each outlet has its own institutional interests, commercial, editorial, political, that determine how it frames the story. And the framing choices made by media institutions become part of the documentary record that future investigations draw from. The coverage is not a neutral account of events. It is itself a form of institutional action. Most public controversies are symptoms of larger systems. Everything connects. The agreement is a symptom of the collision between the royal institution and the celebrity ecosystem. Tom Bower's commentary is a product of the media incentive structure. The public reaction is shaped by the perception loops that both the royal institution and the celebrity brand have been running simultaneously. The institutional risk is generated by the zone of ambiguity that the collision produced. And the human cost, Claire Whitmore in Bristol, the organization she volunteers for, the families it serves, is the downstream consequence of a system-level conflict that never considered them at all. One final question remains. And it is the question the framework has been building toward since Chapter 1. What happens when nobody controls the narrative anymore? Not what happens when one side wins. Not what happens when the story is resolved. What happens when the narrative machine continues to run in the absence of any clear controller? When both systems have been sufficiently destabilized that neither can reassert authority over the story's direction. That is the condition this story has reached. And the answer to that question is what the verdict is going to deliver. Here is the verdict. Not a recap. The verdict. The agreement's existence proved that the public narrative, as delivered across multiple broadcasts, interviews, and a 416-page memoir, was not complete. Incompleteness is not deception. But incompleteness in a narrative that had been publicly declared authoritative is structurally different from incompleteness in a narrative that made no such claim. The timeline proved that the sequence of events, as publicly understood, requires revision. Not dramatic revision, quiet revision, the kind that changes the meaning of individual statements without requiring that any single statement be declared false. Quiet revision is more difficult to recover from than dramatic contradiction, because it cannot be resolved with a single correction. The media reassessment proved that the confidence of sympathetic coverage is conditional, not permanent. When aligned coverage is withdrawn, even slowly, even partially, it is not replaced by neutrality. It is replaced by scrutiny. And scrutiny, applied to a narrative constructed for sympathetic audiences, finds things that sympathetic audiences were not looking for. The human cost proved that the mechanism does not stay at the institutional level. It descends. It reaches volunteers in Bristol and donors in London and charitable organizations that had no strategic stake in the narrative war and no ability to protect themselves from its downstream consequences. The institutional risk proved that uncertainty is not a reputational problem. It is a commercial one. Brand partnerships are confidence calculations. Legal frameworks are risk assessments. Charitable relationships are donor confidence investments. All of them degrade in the presence of sustained, unresolved narrative uncertainty, not catastrophically but consistently, in ways that compound over time. 5 documented elements, 5 pieces of evidence, 1 mechanism, and the mechanism closes here. She is trapped between explaining a story that raises new questions and ignoring a story that allows those questions to grow on their own. That sentence is the verdict, not a judgment about character, not a verdict about intention or motivation, a structural verdict about the position the mechanism has created. Explaining the agreement reopens the timeline, which reopens the interviews, which reopens the question of completeness, which generates more scrutiny. Ignoring the agreement allows the existing questions to accumulate without any attempt at resolution, which allows the uncertainty to compound, which makes the institutional risk worse, not better. There is no version of the response that does not have a cost. That is what a mechanism looks like when it closes. Information rarely destroys influence. Loss of trust does. The agreement did not destroy anyone's narrative. It introduced a question the narrative could not absorb without changing its shape. And when a narrative built on completeness and authority is required to change its shape, it loses the quality that made it effective in the first place. Not the facts, the feeling of certainty, the feeling that this version of events is the version, the one that accounts for everything, that leaves no unremarked documents sitting in the public record, that cannot be reopened by an investigative author pointing at a date-stamped page. That feeling is gone. And here is my question for you, and I want a real, specific theory in the comments, not a reaction. What do you think is more powerful, controlling information or controlling trust? Is it possible to recover one without the other? Is there a version of this story where the narrative regains the quality of completeness? And if so, what does that move look like specifically? Drop your theory below. I read every single one, because history shows that powerful institutions rarely fall when facts appear. They begin to shake when certainty disappears.